The dust settled around the stagecoach as it rolled to. Subscribe to our channel and like the video, and stay tuned for more content like this. A stop in front of the general store, and Jake Morrison felt his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to break free. He'd been standing on that wooden walkway for the better part of an hour, his best shirt pressed so many times the fabric had started to shine, his boots polished until he could see his own nervous reflection in the leather. He'd written to the matrimonial agency 6 months ago, in a moment of loneliness so profound it had ached in his bones. The winters on his ranch outside of Silver Creek, Montana, had grown longer each year, the silence in his cabin so complete he sometimes spoke aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was only his own. He was 32 years old, owned 300 acres of good grazing land, had a herd of cattle that would make any rancher proud, and absolutely no one to share any of it with. The agency had sent him 3 letters from prospective brides. He'd chosen Mary Elizabeth Thornton based on her careful penmanship and her simple description of herself, a practical woman of 26 years, experienced in keeping house, seeking an honest husband and a quiet life in the West. She'd sent a small photograph, slightly blurred, showing a woman with dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a high-necked dress, her expression serious and composed. Jake had written back immediately, describing his ranch, his prospects, his simple life. He'd been honest about everything: the isolation, the hard work, the long winters, the fact that the nearest town was 5 miles away and consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other buildings. He told her he wasn't a man of fancy words or grand gestures, but he'd treat her with respect and kindness, and she'd never want for anything he could provide. Her response had been equally straightforward. She would come. They would marry. They would build a life together, sensibly and practically, 2 adults making a reasonable arrangement that would benefit them both. The stagecoach door opened, and Jake stepped forward, removing his hat and clutching it between his hands like a shield. The driver climbed down and began unloading luggage from the top of the coach. A drummer stepped out first, followed by an elderly couple who were immediately met by their grown son. And then she appeared. Jake's carefully rehearsed greeting died in his throat. The woman who stepped down from that stagecoach bore absolutely no resemblance to the photograph he'd studied for months. Where he'd expected severity, there was vitality. Where he'd anticipated plainness, there was something that stopped his breath entirely. She was tall, nearly as tall as Jake himself, with shoulders held back in a posture that suggested she'd never apologized for her height in her life. Her traveling dress was a deep burgundy, dusty from the journey but well made, and it fit her figure in a way that made Jake forget every word of English he'd ever learned. But it was her face that left him truly speechless. This wasn't the pinched, serious woman from the photograph. Her hair was indeed dark, but it caught auburn lights in the afternoon sun, and rather than being pulled back in a severe bun, it was arranged in a softer style that framed features far more striking than pretty. Her eyes were large and expressive, her mouth generous, her chin determined. There was something almost fierce about her beauty, if beauty was even the right word for it. Arresting, perhaps. Unforgettable. She looked around the small gathering with those keen eyes, and when her gaze landed on Jake, she didn't blush or lower her eyes demurely as he'd expected. Instead, she studied him with the same frank assessment he was giving her, and then, apparently satisfied with what she saw, she walked directly toward him with a stride that covered ground like she owned every inch of it. "Mr. Morrison, I presume?" Her voice was lower than he'd expected, rich and clear, with an accent that suggested education and places far more sophisticated than Silver Creek, Montana. "Ah, yes, ma'am. Jake Morrison." He realized he was still clutching his hat, and hurriedly put it back on his head, then immediately snatched it off again. "You're Miss Thornton?" "I am." She extended her hand, not limply as ladies were supposed to do, but firmly, like a man sealing a business deal. Her grip was strong, her palm calloused. These were not the soft hands of a woman who'd spent her life in drawing rooms. "Though I suppose we should dispense with formalities, given the circumstances. You may call me Mary." "Yes, ma'am. Mary." Jake was acutely aware that his own voice sounded strangled. Your photograph was taken 10 years ago by my aunt, who believed that young women should look humble and modest in all things, including photographs. A slight smile touched her lips, transforming her face entirely. I hope you're not too disappointed by the reality. I assure you, I'm still quite practical and capable of keeping a house, despite not looking as dowdy as that picture suggested. Disappointed? Jake finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. No, ma'am. Not disappointed. Just surprised. Pleasantly, I hope? He met her eyes then, those intelligent, assessing eyes that seemed to see right through him, and decided that honesty was the only policy that would work with this woman. I'd be a fool to claim otherwise. But I'm wondering why a woman like you would need to answer a matrimonial advertisement at all. Something flickered across her face then, something that might have been pain or anger or both, quickly masked. That, Mr. Morrison, is a story for another day. For now, I'm tired from my journey, I'm dusty, and I'd very much like to see this ranch you described in your letters. I assume we're proceeding with the marriage as planned? The directness of the question should have unsettled him, but instead, Jake found himself appreciating it. There was no coyness here, no games. This was a woman who spoke her mind and expected honest answers in return. Yes, ma'am. Unless you've changed your mind, seeing as the reality of me might not match what you expected either. She looked him up and down with that same frank assessment, taking in his height, his broad shoulders built from years of ranch work, his weathered face, his calloused hands. You're taller than I imagined. Stronger looking. You didn't mention in your letters that you were handsome. Jake felt heat rising up his neck. Didn't seem relevant. I appreciate the modesty. She glanced around the small town, at the rough buildings and dusty street. Well then. Shall we proceed? I believe the custom is to marry quickly in these arrangements. The preacher's expecting us tomorrow morning, if that suits. I've arranged for you to stay at the boarding house tonight. Mrs. Henderson runs it, and she's a respectable woman. I wouldn't want anyone thinking. He trailed off, unsure how to finish. That you'd compromise my virtue before we're properly wed? That slight smile again, with something like amusement dancing in her eyes. How very considerate. Yes, tomorrow morning will be fine. Though I must warn you, Mr. Morrison, I have several trunks of belongings. I hope you have room for them in whatever wagon you've brought. I've got my buckboard. We'll make room. As they walked toward where he'd left his wagon, Jake's mind was reeling. He'd expected a simple arrangement, a practical woman to share the work and the loneliness, someone to cook and clean and perhaps, eventually, to warm his bed in the simple, functional way of two people fulfilling their marital duties. He'd expected quiet conversations, companionable silence, a life of routine and purpose. What he was getting, he was beginning to realize, was something else entirely. Mary Elizabeth Thornton directed the placement of her trunks with the confidence of a general positioning troops, thanking the stagecoach driver and pressing a coin into his hand that made the man's eyes widen. She climbed onto the buckboard seat without any assistance, arranging her skirts with economical movements, and then turned to Jake with an expression of patient expectation. As they drove toward the boarding house, she asked questions. Not simpering, silly questions about whether he liked flowers or what his favorite food was, but real questions. How many head of cattle did he run? What was his water situation? How did he handle predators? What was his relationship with his neighbors? Did he hire help during roundup and calving season? Jake answered as best he could, increasingly aware that this woman knew more about ranching than he'd expected any woman to know. When he mentioned his struggles with a particular meadow that tended to flood in spring, she immediately suggested a drainage solution he'd never considered. When he talked about his breeding program, she asked intelligent questions about bloodlines and traits. You know cattle, he said finally, unable to hide his surprise. I grew up on a ranch in Colorado, she replied, her voice matter-of-fact. 5,000 acres. My father raised Herefords primarily, though he experimented with crossbreeding toward the end. I worked alongside my brothers from the time I could sit a horse. Your letters didn't mention that. You didn't ask about my past, Mr. Morrison. You asked about my practical skills and my expectations for the future. I answered honestly. I can keep a house. I am practical. And I do seek an honest husband and a quiet life in the West. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. What I didn't mention was why I needed to leave Colorado, or why a woman with my background and education would answer a matrimonial advertisement. Those are longer stories, and ones I'll share with you after we're married, if you still wish to know them. Jake pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. He set the brake and turned to face Mary fully, studying her profile as she looked at the simple building that would be her home for one night before her life changed forever. I'm not a complicated man, Miss Thornton, he said quietly. I work hard, I keep my word, and I treat people fair. I won't pretend to understand why a woman like you would choose a life with a man like me, but I meant what I said in my letters. I'll treat you with respect and kindness. You'll have a home, and you'll never want for anything I can provide. And whatever your reasons for coming here, whatever you're running from or running toward, that's your business until you decide to make it mine. She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, her carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. He saw vulnerability there, and relief, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. Thank you, she said simply. That's more than I expected, and exactly what I needed to hear. As Jake helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunks into the boarding house, as he made arrangements with Mrs. Henderson and confirmed the time for tomorrow's ceremony, as he said his awkward goodbye and drove his buckboard back toward his ranch in the fading light, one thought kept circling through his mind. He'd expected a simple mail-order bride, a practical arrangement, an uncomplicated addition to his uncomplicated life. Instead, he was getting Mary Elizabeth Thornton, a woman who was clearly running from something, who knew more about ranching than most men he met, who spoke her mind and met his eyes and had calluses on her hands that told stories she hadn't yet shared. Tomorrow, he'd marry her. And somewhere beyond that simple ceremony lay a future he suddenly couldn't predict, with a woman who'd already surprised him in every possible way. For the first time in years, Jake Morrison felt something other than loneliness as he drove through the Montana twilight. He felt curiosity, anticipation, and beneath it all, the subtle stirring of something that might, given time, become more than he'd ever dared to hope for when he'd written that first letter to the matrimonial agency. The simple mail-order bride he'd expected was nowhere to be found. But the woman who'd arrived instead might just be exactly what he needed all along, even if he hadn't known it until she'd stepped down from that stagecoach and left him absolutely, completely speechless.